Taking one's own life was considered a crime in Australia until quite recently, and it's the same story in most countries. But it is still illegal and considered a crime in some countries around the world. Now, whenever this information comes up, there is always some people in the comments who think they are so smart, saying, well, they're dead. What are you going to do? Lock up the body? Shockingly enough, the legalities around this topic throughout history and across cultures are complex and difficult for a modern and Western mind to wrap their head around. And that's what we're going to look at today. Heads up, we post death and dying related videos every Friday. So if that sounds like a cup of tea, consider subscribing to the channel. Now let's talk opting out of life and the law. Before we begin, so we're all on the same page, when I say opting out of life or taking one's own life or another similar phrase, I'm not doing it to lighten the mood or to be flippant about the topic. Let's make that clear. YouTube will only let you use the word suicide so many times in a video before it will strike you, even if it's for educational purposes. So please bear with us and just in your head replace the phrase with the S word. Additionally, while voluntary assisted dying will come up in this video, to be clear, that is not the opting out that we are talking about. That's a whole different issue. Okay, onwards. So before we can talk about where opting out is still illegal, let's look at some Australian info on the topic so we can compare. So over here, suicide was never a criminal offence in the code states of Queensland, Western Australia and Tasmania. However, for common law states, it remained a crime until legislatively abolished. For Victoria, it was in 1967. For New South Wales and South Australia, it was in 1983. In Australian Capital Territory, it was 1990. And it was 1996 for the Northern Territory. For the keen-eyed Aussie viewers, you will note the interesting date there, not only being very recent, but also because the Northern Territory gained positive voluntary assisted dying laws in 1995, and in 1997 the legislation was overridden. It was a very interesting 3 years of law in Northern Territory there, and I'm happy to do a video on it, but it will be legislation heavy, so let us know in the comments. So that's when opting out was decriminalised in Australia. And note the difference in wording. It was decriminalised, it didn't become legal. There is a big difference in that wording, and we'll come back to it in a bit. As for other countries, just to give you an idea, opting out or attempting to was decriminalised in Sweden in 1864, Finland in 1910, New Zealand and UK in 1961, Hong Kong in 1967, Canada in 1972, Ireland in 1993, Sri Lanka in 1998, India in 2017, and Singapore in 2020. US peeps, your country and individual state laws on the issue are so incredibly complex and interwoven it could have its own video. But in a nutshell, it was never considered a crime in 16 states. By now, the majority of states have decriminalised it, except for 2, which includes Maryland, where in 2016, a man was charged with attempting suicide and convicted in 2018. I didn't expect to see that. Where is it still illegal? It should be said that working out where opting out is still illegal is not as straightforward as it sounds. In some countries, it was never a crime, therefore never had to be decriminalised, like in Japan, and those countries don't come up in the data. Then you have countries like India and Indonesia, where it has been decriminalised, but certain states within them that are autonomous may still have it criminalised. Additionally, for large countries like Australia or the US, it has been decriminalised state by state over a long period of time, so there's no one date. There is also half a dozen countries like Ghana and Kenya, which as we speak have bills going through their parliaments to decriminalise it, but haven't yet come into effect. So as of today in 2023, there are still 19 countries where suicide and or attempting it are still solidly a crime. These are Gambia, Comoros, Malawi, Nigeria, South Sudan, Somalia, Tanzania, Uganda, Bangladesh, Brunei, Lebanon, Myanmar, North Korea, Oman, Syria, Yemen, Papua New Guinea, Saudi Arabia, and Afghanistan. Now, some of these still have laws on the book, they just don't act on them, but the majority do. If you complete it, punishments include not being buried in a religious, in many cases Islamic cemetery, meaning that you won't be going to heaven or similar, imprisonment of your family, or the invalidation of your will, which creates barriers for families to succession and inheritance, which in many of these cultures is extremely important. If you attempt but fail, you will face imprisonment and fines, have a criminal record, and often be continually harassed by police. And I think a lot of these frankly smart-ass people who say you can't punish a dead person forget that other countries exist. that their country may only punish individuals who commit a crime, but there are countries out there who punish the families of individuals who commit a crime as well. Why is it still illegal? History tells us two reasons. Some of the places where it is still legal or the laws have only recently changed were colonised by the British, who brought their laws with them. And even though Britain left these countries a while ago and they themselves decriminalised in 1961, those laws remained in place and weren't exactly top of the pile when it came to changing laws back to how the country wanted them. But if we put that list up again, you will notice that the vast majority of these countries where it is still a crime are Islamic majority countries, specifically those under Sharia law. Suicide is considered a cardinal sin in Islam, i.e. one of the worst sins. And this is why it gets murky when religion and the law, ye old church and state, are not kept separate. But let's not demonise Islam for this, because opting out is considered a cardinal sin in other major religions as well. Which is why it was illegal in most parts of the world in the past. But when church and state started to separate in each country after hundreds of years throughout Europe and other areas of Christianity, they started to be able to set laws that didn't necessarily have to abide by the church's values. The Gulf states, for example, have a long history of civilization and tribal clans, but having a centralized government is relatively new. And the government's religion is their identity and how they hold control of a fledgling nation. And like we said in other videos, holding on to an extreme identity is a sign of insecurity. And there are many documentaries out there that explain these governments' insecurities and concerns about being overthrown by their people. Control is key in this case. However, on the other hand, there are many Muslim majority countries that have a solid, unified government and have been around for a long time that do not criminalise suicide, including Iran, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and more recently Pakistan, UAE, and Kuwait. Difference between legal, illegal, and having no law. So just because something has been decriminalised doesn't mean it becomes legal. These countries that have stated suicide is no longer a crime are not saying you have the legal right to do it, which is where laws around voluntary assisted dying and voluntary euthanasia come in. The countries that have put these laws into effect, such as Australia, have made voluntary assisted dying legal. There is no legal grey area here. If you meet the criteria, it is illegal for you to access it. But ironically, the pioneer country for VAD as we know it, Switzerland, doesn't actually have laws saying that it's legal. Its laws since 1941 just say that assisting someone to opt out is not illegal. And that grey area or loophole is what they've been operating under ever since. It has been proven that keeping suicide a crime doesn't make people any less likely to try it. And it can lead to worse. In the UK during the 1800s, there became a problem of suicidal people being told they would go to hell if they went through with it because they wouldn't have time to repent. So many took to murder in order to get the death penalty and have time to repent. Cases like this are still known to happen in modern day Saudi Arabia for similar reasons. Obviously, by keeping it a crime, people aren't able to reach out for help. The government has no way of keeping track of how bad the problem is, and shame and stigma continues. When schools teach about the separation of church and states in politics class, this is a very good example of why it's needed. And with that, go talk death.